Have you ever felt that? That weird disconnect? You hear about one single person's tragedy, and it just hits you, right, in the gut. But then you see a headline about thousands of people suffering, and you feel surprisingly little, almost numb. Well, it's a totally common feeling, and today we're going to dig into the science behind why it happens. So let's just start with a real-world puzzle. Get this. In 2014, an Ebola outbreak affected over 3,400 people. A fundraiser for disaster relief brought in about $100,000. Okay, now just 1 year later, an online campaign for a single child raised over $1.2 million. Logically, that makes absolutely no sense, right? Way more need resulted in way less help. And that brings us to the central and frankly pretty uncomfortable question for this whole explainer. Why does our empathy system, the very thing that helps us care for each other, seem to short-circuit right when the problem gets massive? So yeah, this is the puzzling paradox we're exploring. It's this fundamental gap between the scale of a tragedy and the scale of our emotional response. And you start to see it everywhere once you know what to look for, from global crises to your local GoFundMe. To really understand this paradox, we first need to give it a name. Psychologists have a term they use to describe this strange and powerful quirk of our minds. It's called compassion fade, and it was coined by the psychologist Paul Slovic. Now, this isn't some personal failing. It's not about you being a bad person. It's a well-documented cognitive bias. It describes our tendency to actually feel less empathy as the number of people who need our help goes up. The writer Kurt Tucholsky absolutely nailed this idea almost a century ago with this quote: "A single death, that's a story, something we can grab onto. 1 million deaths? That just becomes a number." Our hearts connect to stories, not to spreadsheets. So compassion fade is part of a whole family of related ideas. You've also got the collapse of compassion, which is that impulse to just look away when suffering seems too overwhelming. And then there's psychic numbing, which describes how our sensitivity to the value of a single life actually decreases as the total number of lives at risk gets bigger. So we know what this thing is, but why? Why does our brain react this way? To answer that, we really got to dive into the psychology behind this numbness. To get it, it helps to know that our brains kind of have two operating modes. System 2 is our slow, rational, deliberate mind. But System 1 is fast, it's automatic, and it runs on emotion. And compassion fade? Well, that's a classic case of System 1 just taking the wheel. And if we dig a little deeper, there are 3 main things going on. First, there's the affect heuristic. We make judgments based on our feelings, not on logic or numbers. Second, the affective bias. If we can't vividly picture a victim in our mind, our empathy just struggles to connect. And third, and this is a big one, motivated emotion regulation. When we're faced with mass suffering, our brain subconsciously hits the emotional brakes to protect us from being totally overwhelmed. It's basically a defense mechanism. Okay, so this is where all the theory gets very real. Let's take a look at the huge ripple effects this little cognitive quirk has on our world. Paul Slovic, the psychologist we mentioned, he sums up the brutal reality of psychic numbing with this grim equation. It feels so wrong to say, but our behavior shows it's often true. This graph just shows it so clearly. The line going up is the value we place on saving a life. The line going across is the number of lives at risk. See how the value is super high for 1 or 2 people? But as that number grows, the curve just flattens out. Our sense of a life's value just doesn't scale up in a straight line. And this leads right into another crucial idea, the identifiable victim effect. What this means is we are way more motivated to help a single person we can identify, someone with a name, a face, a story, than a big, faceless statistical group, even if that group needs way more help. And hey, it's not just about humans. Think about it. Our hearts go out to this specific panda. We can imagine its story. But a group of pandas facing habitat loss, that's just an abstract concept, and our emotional brain has a really hard time latching onto it. This bias has a massive impact on what we see in the news and what becomes a global conversation. Look at this comparison from January 2015. The Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris killed 12 people and, rightly, triggered immediate worldwide outrage. But in that exact same week, a Boko Haram massacre in Nigeria killed over 2,000 people, and it got almost no initial media coverage. The numbers were too big, the victims too distant, too statistical. And this isn't just about charity or the news. This same cognitive glitch helps explain why we struggle so much with collective action on huge, abstract crises like climate change. The victims are numerous, they're unidentified, and they're spread out across the future. It's like the perfect recipe for compassion fate.
So, what's the takeaway from all of this? Now that we know our brains are wired this way, what does it actually mean for us?
Probably the best way to think about it is with a metaphor. Our compassion is a spotlight, not a floodlight. It's incredibly powerful and bright when you focus it on a single point, but it just can't light up an entire landscape of suffering all at once. It has a narrow, intense focus. And so, I'll just leave you with a final thought to chew on. Now that you know about this built-in bias, this tendency for your own empathy to fade when faced with large numbers, how will you consciously choose to react to the next big headline? How will you decide to fight the fade?